Hello, sweeties. Welcome to Art, Life, and Lives. Art, Life, and Lives is a video series I do over in the choir, which is what I call my Patreon. In these videos, I work on a painting and talk about what I learned from a book that I read. The books are either biographies about individual artists or books about creativity more generally. I switch between those two genres every month. This is an older Art, Life, and Lives. To access all of my videos in this series, you can join the choir by becoming a subscriber on my Patreon. Have fun. Good night, sweeties. A quick note about this video. This was the first video that I made for the Art, Life, and Lives series. I don't think I even called it that in this video yet. Just as a production note, I'm sorry about how my voice sounds. I don't know if I was tired or sick or what, but my microphone certainly wasn't doing me any favors either. I recorded this over a year ago in March of 2023. It's now March of 2024. However, I do think that the content of this video holds up. So I hope you enjoy it. And now here is my first ever Art, Life, and Lives about Ludwig van Beethoven. I kind of want to start doing one video a month where I talk about an artist whose biography I've read. I listen to a lot of artists' biographies while I paint, rather than just take them in and then forget it. This will be a good way for me to record my thoughts and maybe insights about artists. To try this idea out, I'm going with a pretty heavy hitter, Ludwig van Beethoven. But Beethoven is a hard one to start with, for at least two reasons. Both of them have to do with the fact that he's Beethoven. The first reason is that Beethoven is held at a status that effectively zero artists can expect to be held at. He's a global household name 250 years after his death. So it can be hard to glean relatable information about him as a person to incorporate into your life because he appears larger than life. The second reason kind of stems from that, and it's just technical. Because he's become a mythic figure, the accounts of his actual life are usually exaggerated or just made up. The facts are hard to know. The book I read, Jan Swafford's Anguish and Triumph, tries to go against the trend of mythologizing him. He does a good job at attempting to discern myths from facts and get as accurate a picture as possible of the man himself. And when he can't, he's very open about this is just a rumor, this is just how legend has it. So he's a pretty good source to get an accurate picture of Beethoven as a person. So with that book as my source, I think I have a fairly accurate view of everything I'm going to say here. As a person, Beethoven would have been very unpleasant to be around. He was an extremely difficult, stubborn, selfish person who is prone to depression, fits of rage, manipulating people, drinking too much, and everything that goes along with that, and other character and personality defects that many people have to some degree, but like other qualities too, like talent and work ethic, Beethoven had to an extreme level. And one of the people who felt these defects most intensely, probably the most intensely, was Beethoven himself. Reading this book, I kept thinking how much it would have sucked to be Beethoven. As an artist or musician, it's easy to think that the trade-off would be worth it. 250 years after your death, your music is still being played and celebrated around the world. Your music is part of every musician's education. You're a hero. You're a god. And the trade-off is that in your life, you're miserable. But I think that in Beethoven's case, that trade-off is not worth it. Like, to be Beethoven would not be worth that legacy. The sense I got from reading this book was that music was literally the only thing in Beethoven's life that he was good at. The only thing. And even that wasn't easy because he went deaf at a pretty young age, and a very young age in his career. Beethoven was born to an abusive alcoholic father who luckily worked as a musician for the church in town. So Beethoven's talent for music was at least seen by his father to be potentially profitable and was nurtured almost exclusively for that reason. Like he might be able to bring in some money with his talent. And since music started becoming his trade at a young age, he left school to focus solely on music, which was great for his music, again, but maybe a little time learning other things could have made him a more well-rounded person. He never learned how to multiply, for example. So his expense books were just long tables of addition, where a simple multiplication would have just saved him 5 minutes or however long it took him to add up all those numbers. And that's just a microcosm example about the needless difficulty Beethoven had with certain things that he might have been able to learn if he had a more well-rounded childhood, let alone the social skills that kids need to learn at a young age about resolving conflict with others, with their peers, when they have to be around their peers every day. He was deprived of that. So later on, when he would have difficulties with people, he would actually treat the situation like a child would. He would throw tantrums and stuff instead of resolving it. But he got an amazing music education for basically his whole childhood. His whole childhood became about music, which he loved more than anything in the world, so that's a good thing. He became a virtuosic piano player. He was able to move to Vienna, get away from his father, who he hated, and Vienna was like the capital of music in Europe back then. Mozart and Haydn both lived there when Beethoven moved, and they are the two other titans of classical music. People who know nothing about classical music know Mozart, at least. In Vienna, he continued his study with Haydn, who was the most popular composer at the time, except for maybe Mozart. So he studied hard and with the best of the best. And that's one of the first things I took from Beethoven, was that he did have talent early on, and it seemed to come natural to him. And instead of coasting on that, he studied a lot. He studied the necessary technical and complicated music theory to better understand the medium that he was going to work in. There's also this work ethic that has stuck with me. This phrase about this work ethic, which I think is a double-edged sword, but the phrase that keeps coming up in the book is this sentiment in Beethoven's time and place that goes something like, "That which is difficult is good." And that's a really good sentiment when talking about studying music theory, about studying drawing fundamentals. That sentiment is something that Beethoven embodied in his work ethic and in his music itself. His music was complicated for musicians to play. Musicians would see a Beethoven score and they'd be like, "What are you doing?" But that pushed boundaries in music. Learning a Beethoven symphony wasn't easy. Haydn and Mozart symphonies were basically written to be played on the first time seeing the score. And the first people to hear Beethoven symphonies didn't understand them. A lot of his music didn't get praised until it had been repeated a few times, because it's demanding of the listener. And especially back then, music was just supposed to be pleasant sounds. Beethoven demanded that, no, music is more than that. The beautiful sounds can contrast other sounds and create meaning through dynamics. The beautiful sounds and the harsh sounds build on each other to tell a kind of abstract story of pure, raw emotion. But to understand that, people actually had to listen. That which is difficult is good. He was also an amazing improviser. He thought that improvisation was one of the most important things a musician could do. And I would take it a step further and say that it's probably one of the most important things that an artist can do. Drawing from observation and using guides is how we learn, but being able to draw freehand out of your own head, like someone like Kim Jong-gi, is a super important next step of development. So Beethoven could pick 3 random notes and then play for hours on themes from just these 3 notes that were picked out randomly, incorporating his deep knowledge of music and his ability to translate his deep feelings through that knowledge at will. He would just get into a mode. According to legend, and some of it is probably true, people would weep, and they say that people would faint, which is like the most 1800s thing to say about something, is that somebody fainted when the first time they heard it. But I'm sure that the weeping is true, because if you've ever listened to Beethoven's music, he really can pull some emotional strings. But he would just get into this mode where he could do that for hours. One of his friends gave a name to this mode that Beethoven would get into when he was like this, when he was lost in playing or focused on music to the exclusion of everything else. His friend called it his raptus. But what the raptus seems to be, as described by the book, was essentially a flow state, a state of deep focus, which any artist or athlete knows as a peak experience in some of the most satisfying moments in life. Beethoven lived for the raptus, for the flow state. So that might be a better motto to take from Beethoven than that which is difficult is good. Another thing which I found very inspiring about Beethoven, which also might be a double-edged sword, was the alchemical process of turning suffering into art. He only wrote a few original compositions when his hearing started to noticeably deteriorate. Think about how terrifying this would be. You study a craft that you love, that you find deep meaning and satisfaction from. You work super hard on it, harder than most people work at anything. You dedicate your life to it. You finally get to a level of doing it where you're making a living and getting a reputation as being one of the best to ever do it. And then one of the main senses that you rely on to do that thing starts fading away. And it wasn't just about the fear of not making music. He was in a super cutthroat competitive environment as a musician in Vienna at the time. Work was hard to come by, so he had to hide it. He had to hide the fact that he was losing his hearing, because if the rumor took hold that old virtuoso big shot Ludwig was actually deaf, he wouldn't get work. Just people wouldn't hire him. They wouldn't trust him. He went off to the country and wrote this letter that has come to be known as the Heiligenstadt testimony. It's addressed to his brothers, and in it he admits that he's going deaf, and he expresses his anger and disgust and sorrow about this development. He expresses his regret for how he treats people because he is suffering, and he can't tell people why he's suffering. Parts of it read like a suicide letter, but he kept it. He never showed anyone. It was discovered after he died. But the timeline of writing that note lines up with the writing of some of his most original music. After writing that letter of despair, he wrote his Eroica Symphony, which took a while to catch on, but really did change the scope and boundaries of the symphony and of music. It pushed music more in the direction of expressing pure feelings and narrative rather than following convention. He turned this suffering and pain into innovative, original art, which has stood the test of time. This aspect of art is one of the most important things to me. There's no way out of suffering in life, but there is a process to make something of that suffering, which Beethoven consciously did. And that process is art. I said earlier that this aspect is a double-edged sword, though, because there was a recurring pattern in Beethoven's life regarding this. That deep sorrow, that pain, that anguish, many times self-inflicted, then a creative flurry and the alchemical process and all that, resulting in genius, original, lasting work. Then on Beethoven's part, a deep loneliness. Beethoven had almost nothing outside of his art. And the older he got, the work remained on the same trajectory of getting more and more original, more and more innovative. He himself stayed on the same trajectory of being lonely at the end, except with the added layer of deteriorating more and more as years caught up with him. Is it possible that Beethoven could have created the same amount of originality and also had like a loving companion or good relationships in his life. He did have a few good relationships, but there was always turmoil. But who knows? Who knows? There's no way to know. But regardless of the myth of the man, the legacy of lasting work, in Beethoven's moment to moment experience of life, a little more compassion and patience with other people would have benefited everyone around him, including and especially himself. So yes, use your pain, your suffering, your heartache, your disgust, your anger. Turn it into art. But also remember that you only live one time, and even on a totally selfish level, you'll feel better if you're kinder, more patient, and compassionate with those you have to be around and who have to be around you. You actually want to be better. That's what I took away from the Beethoven biography the most. I actually liked doing this, so I'm going to try and do it for one of the next books I read. Thank you. Good night, sweeties.